So just to sort of emphasize and try to make an overarching polemic that, yeah, I'm probably not explaining and outlining perfectly. Well, definitely not. But, I mean, calling it a bandwagon is one way of sort of describing it. But the actual, how it operates collectively, um, is very interesting because it's almost like a kind of overt conspiracy in some sense, because you know they all know the game that they're playing. They all in some sense know that they're not being intellectually honest. The journalistic component is functioning as propaganda for the political activism or for the ideology, because it's fundamentally analogous to a placebo, that it doesn't work unless everyone believes that that is the method. So it's sort of like the ends justify the means, and therefore, but for the means to even function, it has to have 100% buy-in. Uh, and so that's how they kind of justify, that they have chosen, their intellectuals, their authorities have chosen that this is the most expedient measure, and therefore everyone has to get onto the program. And so it's beyond politics. It's analogously, it's like it's like a cultural theocracy being imposed by the mainstream sort of or the media consensus or whatever. So you've got people with this ideology that has tactically, intellectually dominated, certain tactical sectors. The how and this is because the halls of power are filled with these kinds of activist ideological lobbyists, and the kind of things that political economy allow for are essentially politicians that are very good at being, let's say, responsive to mob reactive, immediate sentiment, and sort of riding the tide of that. The kind of because and this is exacerbated because journalism has essentially lost its function, and you can't really have a functioning democracy when you don't have a functioning public discourse, when you don't have, when you are culturally not allowed to do anything but toe the ideological line according to this particular cultural hegemon that we have to live with, which is essentially this identitarian identity politics, fascistic conception of society, and that and by statistically maneuvering from the top down and imposing quotas and sort of forcing the outcome that somehow everything else will work itself out, that is the only means to do it. And anyone who tries to sort of show that this whole thing is not working, that it causes destabilization, that it's fundamentally corrupt, that it undermines meritocracy, that it makes the kinds of inefficiencies in the systems invisible and impossible to correct. It's a weird kind of self-agonizing ideological complaint, because they want things to be disrupted. They want the system to collapse, because that's proof of their moral superiority over the system. So it's like they're going to erode it and sort of undermine it, and then while they're undermining it, they will talk about how evil it is and how it deserves to be undermined, and how ineffective it is after it's already essentially been led by them into a spiraling doom spiral. And the idea is that at some point, after it reaches the equilibrium point within their ideological morality schema that they've depicted, somehow when you reach that threshold, then everything resets at zero and you're in imagination land. But practically, because their ideology has no sense of reality, it's only fixated and obsessed with this moral calculus, which is also how they can create their journalistic propaganda, how they can create their false dilemmas, how they can frame things, leveraging technical possibility and not interrogating basic facts, not interrogating, sort of basic interpretation. You can see, I mean, so we're sort of months into the lockdown, or at least a month into the lockdown, and I'm listening to a radio host talk to a professor, and only at the very end of the interview, does the professor say something which is almost unexpected by the radio host, which is that he actually believes that we should actually get the virus to spread faster through the population because our ICU capacity is being underutilized, and it's inevitable that the virus is going to go through the population, and so we need to maximize the speed at which it's going through, because otherwise, what's the point of the lockdown? It's a you're buying time for what? Unless you're going to have increased capacity, you're generating a stalemate, and you still have the inevitable that you're going to end up facing anyway. And in fact, the slower it spreads, the worse off. I mean, that perhaps is a controversial added benefit to say, but the slower it spreads, you're missing out on the benefit of having herd immunity sooner. So, I mean, you can say that maybe that is slightly controversial, but again, I mean, that's, because you can not, I mean, look, herd immunity is a high standard, but you would at least get perhaps some herd resilience. If you didn't reach herd immunity, at least perhaps, I mean, this is why, for example, you often, with the original SARS, you get flare-ups every 5 years, because COVID viruses generally confer immunity, which lasts about 5 years, and so you get sort of peak resurgences that you kind of get a remembered, when there was a bad flu 1 year, then 5 years later there's like a kind of another wave of a bad flu, because that 5 year cycle of immunity was reset in some sense. But so there are levels of resilience that generally slow the spread and make it easier for medical facilities to absorb things. So anyway, there are all these sort of basic sort of things. I mean, how about, for example, CNN, for instance, or anyone, like, how about just interviewing the experts from countries that haven't used a lockdown, Sweden being a prime example. Why do I have to go and fish some interview to see the government people that are in charge of the government policy, who are professors, who are talking about how the Imperial College study is just complete bunk, and it will never be peer reviewed because it's such junk, because it's such absolute hysteria mongering, the whole, I mean, he effectively, I mean, he said it politely. He said that study should generally be regarded as controversial. That's the politest way to say it, Anyway, why don't we have a spotlight shone on that? Instead, everyone, you just get these waves of this buzzword that just feeds into this lowest common denominator, security thirst, that somehow the Chinese mode of dealing with it becomes sort of the standard care because someone already did it, so that's already in the mind, and you can't even have this weird kind of logic of the most conservative line of being averse to any kind of risk, and then you can't even mitigate risk in the round properly. This kind of complexity can only be, understood if you have a more dynamic journalism, which journalism is not capable of doing, because it's they've radicalized themselves with their own tactical deployment that they have been regimented by now, and they're stuck in the same because they try to create false dilemmas that are supposedly all centered around one question of fact. And this is why they will often cite these little factors which like generally support a worldview essentially, and it's just it's such it comes from like the least amount of intelligence possible actually being focused on the actual issue at all, and looking at the different case scenarios, let's just say. But like any of the real experts would have told you right from the start that it was highly, it obviously it wasn't proven, but essentially it was always going to be anticipated. It was right from the start anticipated. This is why they never had a lockdown in the UK at the start, and why Sweden was very happy that at least Britain was with them on not having a lockdown, and then Britain did a 180-degree turn, and Sweden continued to not have a lockdown because they're like, no, this, you know, the expert advice actually, the actual reasonable experts haven't changed their views. It's just the hysteria and having a political class that essentially can't tolerate trusting the people to make intelligent decisions because they don't have an intelligent sense-making organ, journalism, in the state anymore. Journalism is effectively just bankrupt. It's intellectually bankrupt. It's morally bankrupt, and those two things are connected. And essentially, politics has to deal with that as a real factor. Essentially, they have to manage that as a real factor. That essentially we've got a public discourse that is fundamentally incapable of doing anything politically other than essentially averaging out into essentially the Chinese model of citizenry. The Chinese political model essentially, it has become the de facto society. Essentially, it has become the de facto so all the framing that we have, I mean, we can just see how brittle it is, how essentially it's how the identity politics fascists have essentially won at remaking society and politics into the fear-driven hysteria mob. When you create a kind of mob mentality hysteria that the politicians have to model the citizens as, because that is how they are spoken to by the journalists. I believe that it's better to blame the journalists than it is to blame the politicians, because that is how it is happening, and that is how it's continuing to happen. And without a more dynamic, and the journalists, I guess, are just taking a consumer approach. We're giving the people what they want to consume. That is our job. We're creating a commodity. They don't, the institutional trust that the news had, that journalists had, the ethos, to kind of to help people sense make, and to tell them and to inform them and to interrogate reality on behalf of the citizenry. It's completely been subverted, to turn on, this. Because they've acclimatized themselves to too many identity politics sacred cows, because they have essentially already crafted their industry around the sacred cows. Now they can't distinguish between, well, which sacred cows are we allowed to go after? Because if they did that, they would fundamentally see their own fundamental Tower of Babel, as it were. They would fundamentally see the corruption in how they are structured and how they process information and how they interrogate it. Because, to deal with that kind of issue of complexity, it would undermine the tactics that they are used to deploying. Okay, so that's the overarching point. I think I'm actually going to put this recording right at the start, because it's such a laborious 40 minutes of me just making this point, but I hope that other people make this point, because this itself is a newsworthy point. It's a point of social commentary that's prescient, and that needs to sort of, we need to diagnose what's really sick with society. And what's sick with society, I think proximately we can say it's all the journalists' fault, but in how people are in how journalism addresses the public is creating the rudiment, it's creating the anchor that is grounding this, I can only call it the fascistic style of politics. And I know I'm calling it, I'm saying also that it's similar to the Chinese political model. I understand, but in some sense you have to understand, in the same way that the Chinese are state sovereign, that they believe in the sovereignty of the state, that kind of that political conception of the statist moral authority and the role of the state in deploying moral authority, and how we are expected, the state, to be an arbiter on moral authority, is fundamentally Napoleonic. So I mean, I just generally call that proto-fascist, I guess. So and I think that any kind of state sovereignty fundamentally is vaguely, at least. Uh, uh, I like to distinguish. I'm not saying that they are fascist. I'm saying that they have a fascist worldview, that they have a fascist conception of people and society and groups, which is, I mean, that's fundamentally the identity politics thing. And in some sense, I think that that's the level at which actually the West, or the Anglosphere, whatever you want to call it, has moved itself culturally towards China instead of the other way around. That it's not that China failed to become westernized and more liberal, it's that the West has fundamentally lost its libertarian framework. It has undermined it ideologically by buying into this poison, and so uh, that has created less of a drive for the Asian middle classes in China. Well, I shouldn't say. I mean, I guess what are the other countries that don't really have? I mean, in some sense, we were still also working on Japan, because Japan also has a kind of state sovereign. I mean, Japan is obviously, in a technical sense, it's a very liberal political sphere, but culturally, they still culturally sort of anyway. Okay, so this is a broader issue, and I'm touching on a lot of different things. But anyway, the point is that if the West had kept itself going, it would be better for everyone, because then everyone could work towards progress still. But now essentially it's kind of poisoned the chalice to some degree, and hopefully we can find a way to get back on track, because otherwise, it's only if it it's only going to get worse, as it were. And in some sense, the kind of Trump style politics is the proximate antidote to this, because at least it will allow the grounding of, let's say, political realism in kind of grounding international politics will in more reality, rather than just the ideology of just pure identity. Grounding it in nationalism again would allow then people to find out what's really going on in reality, and then work out, okay, well, now we all have real interests again, so then how do we negotiate them? Oh, we're going to have to actually compromise with something that works for everyone, and work out what we're trading here, and actually work out how things are better when we work together. But it has to actually be engineered. It actually has to be practically thought about. It's not just an obvious thing that we just throw ourselves in. It actually has to be calibrated. It has to be calculated. It actually has to be. It has to have a vision that is agreed on, that and that practically functions for everything, in terms of what that particular treaty might pertain to, or whatever. So. Which is still, like, that paradigm is still just completely in the blind spot of this identity politics stuff, because in the identity politics stuff they are more kind of local fascists. They're like micro, in the same way that you get like micro anarchists. These people are like micro fascists, these identitarians, and so they're so kind of disorientated generally, because their metaphysics is almost I mean, I've described them as hybridized histrionic. So it's almost like having a histrionic personality disorder, but they have they have an ideological manifestation of histrionic personality disorder, because their identity and their self-concept have essentially are relating on a conceptual level at such a close level that they end up framing their relationships to other people and to society at large and to themselves through identity. And so and obviously that is very toxic and poisonous and potentially dangerous as well, because that can manifest as a level of group hysteria and group delusion, which, I mean, I would say that journalism is one of the effects of this. Um, uh, I was going to make a point maybe about the cascade of how, sort of poisoning the well has poisoned the village, in terms of how how this thing sort of snowballs, and it, and it's so, it's interesting how it generally changes society into a weird kind of self-sympathizing excuse to deploy its own authoritarianism, where essentially government is justified as a kind of compulsory charity that everyone has to channel their humanity into supporting, and so like political power and political ideology is like the only kind of form that charity takes in some sense. And so government therefore is allowed to concentrate power, accumulate and deploy more intervention over society, and it can just get more and more evil, essentially, because its exercise of power is always rationalized as, well, it just needs more power, and then if it does something wrong, then it's because the wrong people are in charge. But like conceptually, the government needs to have that authoritarian role. And so culture gets more and more rotten as culture fundamentally gets more dependent on that power to do things and to orchestrate upon it, above it. And so culture itself fundamentally gets less able to regulate itself because it's fundamentally less vigilant, which is what journalism has been doing. It's been destroying vigilance because it only gets into its false dilemmas of its strange arguments and these technical possibilities, leveraging, the imagination more than the facts on the ground being interrogated. And so you get a dead culture, which fundamentally, you can see CNN and you can see a lot of these identity politics, sort of sided journalist sort of people. You can just see how absolutely intellectually destitute it is. That's what I mean by that it's dead. And then you end up essentially being ruled by a kind of mafia types that hold power. And then they basically sell you protection, ideological protection, under their auspices, because they somehow own the mantle of representation, like, so you get these sorts of, these new, this new aristocracy, which are given wealth and prestige because of how they are essentially enjoying that prestige on behalf of their victimized identity, So it's this weird kind of, it's exactly like, this is how fascism works. The Aryans saw themselves as the biggest historical victims. They were hard done by history and by being infiltrated. So, that's how they justify their venom. That's how they justify their fascistic, it's too easy to find these intellectuals because, vulnerable narcissism is a very sort of addictive and thing that is very good at knowing how to pretend to be intellectual. They can dress these things up. They just use these sort of linchpins of this general narrative, and then they just scatter a few kind of technical possibilities, and then they scatter a few kind of suggestive, things, and therefore, that's the mythology that we live in, and you're not allowed to question the orthodoxy, essentially. So we're culturally in the doom spiral, and hopefully journalism will kill itself at some point, or at least will give up, so that we can get something new in its place. The only solution that I can see is the kind of the YouTube Timcast. I think that is the correct model of news in some sense, because then you've got, let's say, people that represent a point of view, and then you can see them intellectually have it out with one another. You can see them hash it out. They can eventually, they have their own collection of views, their own ideology. So it's news from an opinionated perspective. So it's not pretending to be objective. And then you see these people having conversations with people with opposing views and opposing opinions and opposing frameworks. And then you have everyone has a focal point of how these things relate to one another, how they intersect with one another, what they agree and disagree with. And then you have a much more vibrant smorgasbord of intellectual, depth. Whereas obviously you can't have that in the modern sense, because the identity politics ideology is so brittle, it's so delicate, and it requires so much power just to function. It's ironic. You've never seen so many people that control all the microphones and all the loudspeakers complain about being so disempowered as they run everything into the ground with their disgusting, self self grievance driven cause for their own complaining. It's they will complain that other people aren't essentially employing racist measures so that they aren't able to collect the data to prove the systemic oppression. It's how many different kinds of begging the question can you get in a kind of pseudo-intellectual cacophony of pretentious and disgusting. It's almost demonic. The level of literal depravity and intellectual destitution. Slaves of some kind of, I guess, imaginary solution that join us or you're on the wrong side of history. That's really what it boils down to. And it's like, well, can you really tolerate this onslaught of these suggestive things that we're going to call you a whole lot of ists and phobes, because that's all we have essentially is ad hominem to anyone who doesn't conform. Yeah. Okay. Well, now I'm just ranting. Anyway, let me just focus on the recording will be somewhat elaborate, although it's badly structured. I've been avoiding making this recording just because it's so depressing. It's the title of this video will be very aptly named because I'm going to use it as a metaphor for many things. Take the placebo or die. This is it's even a pretty good rough approximation of the kind of prescriptions, the kind of cultural outlook generated by identity politics, that we should all be on the same page, we should all be on the same placebo, and if you're not going to take the placebo like everyone else and react to it like you should, like we've all agreed to react to it, then you're not going to help this weird kind of rehabilitative process. It's a project that requires a kind of orthodox conformity to make it work. Fake it until you make it. That's the faulty logic at the bedrock of identity politics, effectively, that let's just change the outcome and everything else will take care of itself. We don't have to face the challenges head on. We just have to impose from a top-down scenario, essentially, the equitable outcome as it is divined by the political authority, which has this kind of Napoleonic moral dictatorship for the good of the people. And this is the pseudo-intellectual culture that the media has come to acclimatize itself towards, is used to peddling this take the placebo or die sort of mentality, which I'll say as well, this is kind of how the political ethos in China is operated. It's almost the Chinese model of state, so the kind of the statist sovereign power, and the kind of blind allegiance that kind of rhetoric that is given play. It's interesting. Everyone, I guess, hoped in the 90s that China would slowly acclimatize itself towards a kind of liberal democratic model, which is still potentially possible for it to happen. That there are still enlightened um, middle class Chinese, and it's not necessarily a class thing, but there's at least a small section of the population that wants a kind of real, genuine democracy, and a vibrant, liberal, political, open culture that's open in terms of public discourse. And I guess the West in general has not been doing them any favors, just as the West has not been doing any oppressed group in any um, depressing situation any favors by being taken over by identitarian moral slime, by these strange, capricious feminists that, give uh, auto theo that give theocracies overseas a kind of a blind eye and a free rein, because they're a different culture. I guess the politically correct wouldn't even be nice to me talking about China. It's everyone strangely falls in line with this kind of uh, fascistic worldview of a kind of separate but equal development, as they tout essentially the ideology of separate but equal um, identity groups. This is the kind of the strange, murky moral confusion that's at the core of it all, and then the pseudo-intellectualism that that the media are used to pandering to, and it's radicalized them. It's radicalized them to the point at which that they can't even ask basic questions about anything. When this coronavirus thing has happened, I mean, I'm going to make some bold, things that will be labeled as irresponsible, but things that even early in the coronavirus hysteria, uh, my opinion uh, will be vindicated. But um, even in the early stages, it could very easily be puzzled together. Um, this is all going to be about the media. I just like, so like 32 days into the lockdown in my country, a radio host had a professor on to talk about the coronavirus, and right near the end of the interview, the radio host was, you know, asking, I guess, the usual questions that one expects to hear, the same lines parroted by CNN. And right at the end, the professor said something that kind of took him aback, which is that, yes, we should actually hope that the virus starts spreading a bit faster through the population, because we have lots of empty ICU wards, and we have ventilators that are not being used. We're well under capacity, and if we what are we delaying for, essentially? That obviously we need a certain controlled spread. I mean, essentially the only life that lost that you can hope to mitigate is life lost because there's no capacity to absorb the serious cases. But let me just say in general that we will find out at the end of this that the case fatality rate for this disease will likely be lower than the original SARS outbreak. Because in the original SARS outbreak, around 2008, we had people died because there weren't enough ventilators. But that didn't make the news. That wasn't because Obama was the president then, and we didn't have such a corrupted culture of take the placebo or die that is used to groaning and calling for blood because of the systemic oppression and some kind of systemic response. Now we've got an acclimatized public discourse that is used to this kind of hysterical whinging and demands for some kind of top-down, paternalistic, interventionist, moral. I can only call it moralism in the form of the Napoleonic state, which is another way of describing, I guess, the modern Chinese political status quo. And so, it just strike me as very odd that only 30 days in on public radio now do I hear this, and I'll never hear it again probably. I won't hear it on the news. I won't hear it on television, that it would actually be better if we got the virus moving through the population. Because, some people really do think that the point of the lockdown, which is completely disproportionate, the real response that should have been done should be to increase capacity and then to actually have the virus spread so that the capacity can be used. We're doing the worst of all worlds. We're putting all these resources into having increased capacity, and then we're doing everything so that we don't use that capacity. It's sort of like, it's insane. It doesn't have an intelligent mind behind any of it. It's just raw power. The exercise of raw power for no objective rationalization, policy, reasoning. So everyone is prone to the kind of depraved demands of Julius Malema that if the lockdown ends and people die, it's going to be on. It's going to be on. He's going to hold people politically accountable. You get held hostage by that kind of slimy, specious complaining. When it's quite ironic, because the longer that we delay reaching herd immunity, the longer that we delay the virus spreading through the population, do people really think that the vulnerable population will be able to social distance for 2 years? That that we'll have people in our society that will have to be removed essentially and quarantine, or for their safety, that they'll have to stay away from society for 2 years until a vaccine is found? That's what's being implied essentially, if herd immunity is not the proximate goal. Obviously, arriving at herd immunity with certain safety nets for not having the public sector health service overwhelmed. That's the only rationalization that a lockdown can have. That's the only positive effect that a rationalization, that a lockdown can deliver. But it's not being framed that way. And the media has done nothing to actually outline the reality of this at all. It was known. Okay, well, let me just say, the confusion about the death rate. I heard this professor in this interview talking about Italy having a 6%, he said something about 6% mortality. That must be based on the incidence of the intake of the hospital, but no, that's not the case mortality rate. And again, people that use any percentage over 1%, they don't talk about the asterisks. They don't talk about the problem of the denominator. They don't talk about the study that was done in Italy even recently, confirming that the case mortality rate must be south of 1%, must be significantly south of 1%, where they actually tested a whole town essentially, or a sample size of a whole town, to get the denominator right. Because obviously most people, as was anticipated right from the start, most people are going to be completely asymptomatic. And those people aren't being counted as part of the denominator. So we've got still these people saying these crazy percentages as if that's the case mortality rate. And all of these insane models of the death toll are all based essentially on assuming a kind of case mortality rate of even 4% or even 1%, which is, well, from the preliminary data, which should have been done right at the start, just doing population sampling to work out how much of the population had already been infected. I mean, Oxford believed that up to 50% of the British population likely already had it. Now, I understand that that's two likelies, that's two generalizations. So, I mean, obviously they're just completely guessing because no one actually did that study in Britain. Crazy. How can you not do that study? How is that not the first study that is done? Work out what is the general rate of contamination within the population. Because if it is already 50%, then what is the point of a lockdown? Everyone essentially already has it. Yeah, well, it's I mean, the most responsible thing really would have been to have very stringent quarantine essentially for the vulnerable population, while everyone else was healthy without pre-existing conditions, would be encouraged almost to get it as soon as possible, to make general society safer for the vulnerable so that they don't have to wait 2 years in social distancing and isolation, so that they can also return to, I mean, how do people expect that for 2 years that these people are going to have absolutely no and now that we are effectively delaying herd immunity, we are actually exacerbating certain risks. You know, there are certain things, and I don't just mean economically, I mean medically, there are very good reasons not to slow down. The slower the virus spreads, and the slower you delay herd immunity, the more opportunity you give the virus to mutate. So that's another calculus which is completely being disregarded and overlooked because of this fake narrative. The idea that somehow we're going to stamp the virus out and it's not going to spread, and some people will never get it. That's not how these things work. It's going to go through the whole population. The question is when, and pragmatically speaking, it's not possible to delay that by 2 years, except if you have a lockdown. If you have the same lockdown that we've had now for 2 years, which is not economically viable. I mean, not even first world countries can afford to do that. And again, we will find out. I mean, the numbers are a bit fake as well, because when SARS was going through the population, people weren't as prolifically invested in making sure that everyone that died of flu, that the death certificate was made out, or the register of deaths was recorded as being because of SARS. Perhaps comorbidity would have been put into that. But we will find out that when we actually have an intense research on the case fatality rate, that SARS was more deadly. SARS was also more infectious than this virus. But no one remembers any of this because I guess Obama was the president when SARS happened, and hospitals were also flooded during the SARS outbreak. They really were, and they just took it in their stride. I mean, you put numbers of deaths in bold. I mean, public health. We've got countries with millions and millions of people. Public health is a different kind of calculus, and you can't. There's certain things that you can't stop. You can't stop. You can mitigate the damage that a virus does. You cannot stop a virus like this from going through the population. It's a question of when. And the longer we delay herd immunity, the worse it is overall, especially for the vulnerable population. In some sense, it makes them more vulnerable. It also makes them more vulnerable to the ravages of social distancing and isolation, and whatever economic impact that might have on them. But all of this kind of calculus, all these sorts of reasonable questions, all these sorts of basic questions, which you would think that 30 days after a lockdown, that this would already be how it would be framed. But no one dares to ask basic questions. No one dares to gather basic information. No one dares to actually make sense of any of this stuff. No one dares to look at what the Swedish medical establishment has said about its strategy. They were actually very upset when the British, halfway through not doing anything, did a 180-degree turn on this, because it was them and Britain were almost the only ones that were staying to the sane strategy, and then they left Sweden all alone, essentially, with their no lockdown. I mean, just because you don't have a lockdown doesn't mean that you can't promote precautions. I mean, you do want to pace the spread as much as you can, especially to the vulnerable, because we only have so much ICU and so many ventilators. So what you do is you tackle the problem from a supply side of the medical resources. You focus on increasing the capacity, and then you essentially get people to do certain practices that will slow the spread, and then perhaps even in some places you even want to increase it. It would actually be better to do something like a rolling blackout, where you try and essentially get herd immunity in certain zones while everyone else is very strict on social distancing, and then you disperse the intense cases across the other medical facilities in the other zones that are being more strict, or something like that. I mean, even what I'm saying, it just sounds like Greek, I guess, because the narrative is so far gone from anything resembling reality. Okay, I guess those are all the points that I wanted to raise. It's really depressing. I mean, this is the kind of hyper-realism. I mean, it's almost Orwellian. There was one more angle that I didn't spell out, which is quite an important angle, which is, I do think that proximately the problem is the media. I mean, it's also certain politicians themselves, which are thankfully in opposition parties in most of the first world. I guess it's not true in my country. The ANC has got a large contingent of this ideological social justice stuff because it helps conceal the corruption nicely and such, but or divert the pressure and empower more kind of top-down administration of resources in society through political influence. But I can be sympathetic to certain governments because they're being held to account by a media that is fundamentally too stupid. It is they frame the public essentially as this needy child, this infantilized, imbecile that can't understand anything that's slightly complicated, unless it's completely made simplistic and oversimplified in the kind of polemic that they are used to feeding them in terms of the identity retributivistic, kind of social justice narrative. And any kind of political class is going to you have to take these sorts of lines. You have to take this kind of authoritarian, oversimplified narrative, and the media even conform to it. They're like, oh no, this is not the time to ask questions. Everyone needs to look like that they're on the same page. It's like a contest of a race to the bottom. But so I guess now I'm just echoing the same point. But in some sense, the media frames the public to be the kind of in need of this infantilizing political authority, and they frame the world in to reflect that ideological framing, and under that kind of spotlight, politicians are prone to this lowest common denominator outrage, this hysteria. But yeah, in terms of the proximate problem, you can say that, oh no, this is what the public expects, so the media have to deliver what the public expect. But because journalism is fundamentally lost kind of all of its integrity, that there is no intelligent questioning, there's no basic questioning that tests the systemic narrative and how to make things safe. You can see just how it's on all the points that it shares thematically with identity politics in terms of the framing of problems. You can see that kind of ideological worldview sort of just loves a crisis like this to validate its buttons, to validate its how it likes to frame the world. And journalism is still delivering exactly what the sentiment is asking for. It's just more, yes, let us help tell everyone how they must take the placebo or die. That becomes the line at which there is this pseudo-intellectual agreement and this kind of bandwagon cult, and they will clear away anyone who steps out of line, and this is how cultural liberalism in the West in general, I think, has ceded to a kind of Chinese style statist sovereignty, or at least statist moral authority over society and population. That it's just a juxtaposition from, we had hoped that China would grow more liberal, and instead it has been the rest of the world that has adopted the Chinese political model. But yeah, I think it's for ideological reasons. It's because of the ideology that the current media is fundamentally enamored with, that it's fixated on, and that has radicalized their sense-making capabilities, in which they can't make sense. They can't make sense of the world. They can't question the world. They can't gather basic facts together. They can't get the story straight. It's just hysterical outrage, hyperbole. There's no historical comparison. There's no actually talking to the experts in the field that actually talk about the case mortality rate. People are still using these numbers from Italy, which have not been even attenuated by the latest research, which was research that was anticipated before that research was done. It was already anticipated. It was already widely known that a lot of people were going to be asymptomatic, and that it was very likely. Even Dr. Fauci, in his own academic research, whenever he talks on CNN, he talks about a death rate of 1%, while before and after saying things like that on CNN, his own academic papers and his own modeling talk about 0.1%. And by the way, 0.01% is lower than SARS, than the original SARS outbreak. So you really have to ask yourself, what is going on? We have literally lived through a worse outbreak with SARS. What is different, other than the appetite, other than the mainstream media's appetite for they just completely lost the plot. I think we are living in the hyper-realism of a fascistic culture, because I've said this. There's no point in repeating it. But that's all the that's the basic outline. Someone should write an article about that.